Welcome to part 2 of this overview webinar of the Streamlined Contracting with NGOs Contracting Framework. In the first part of this webinar, we looked at the contracting framework and the different documents and tools that form the framework. We went through the government agency agreement and explained what it is and the commitments that agencies and MBIE make when they sign that agreement. In the second part of this webinar, we're going to look at the framework terms and conditions. If you have not already viewed part 1, please do so before you view this part. This is important as we cover a lot of terminology and important background and contextual information in part 1. The framework terms and conditions are the standard terms and conditions that are incorporated by reference into all outcome agreements. Together, these framework terms and conditions and the outcome agreement form a contract between the agency and a provider for the services described in each outcome agreement. It's important to understand the framework terms and conditions, as they are the backbone of the contractual relationship between agencies and providers. So, what do they say? The framework terms and conditions embed relationship principles that sit across the sector and set the tone for whole-of-sector engagement by government agencies. Those relationship principles focus on the agency and provider agreeing to work together to achieve the desired outcomes and act honestly and in good faith, communicate openly and in a timely manner, work collaboratively and constructively, recognise each other's responsibilities, encourage quality and innovation to achieve positive outcomes, maximise value for money to government, and ensuring flexibility so that services can be adapted following discussion between the agency and provider to meet identified and agreed needs. These clauses describe what a government agency must do to use the contracting framework, and note which parts of the contracting framework create legally binding obligations. There are 2 preconditions to using the contracting framework. The agency must sign the government agency agreement, which commits the agency to acting consistently with obligations described there. The first part of this webinar describes that agreement. And it must also sign an outcome agreement describing service to be performed by the provider. The agency also commits to acting consistently with the framework terms and conditions, each outcome agreement, and each outcome agreement management plan it enters. The final clause in this section confirms which documents and parts within the contracting framework create legally binding obligations between the agency and provider. Any remedy plan entered by an agency and provider to remedy any non-performance issues is legally binding, as are the obligations contained in the government agency agreement. The outcome agreement management plan does not create any legally binding obligations, as it's intended to be a contract management tool to help maximise the benefit of the relationship between the agency and provider. The services section requires the providers to perform the services as described in the outcome agreement and, importantly, creates the link between the provision of services and a contribution to desired population or community outcomes recorded in the outcome agreement. That link is really important in establishing whether the services are effective at contributing to those outcomes. Under payment, the agency will pay the provider to deliver the services. The times and amounts for payment are agreed and written into the outcome agreement. The next section of the framework terms and conditions is about how the contract will be managed. The underlying principle is that the agency will follow best practice contract management. This means making sure that the contract management requirements are proportionate to the nature and value of the services and associated risks to the agency and clients. The focus should be on evaluating the effectiveness of services and whether the desired client and population or community outcomes are being achieved. Both the provider and agency must communicate regularly with each other so that they can monitor performance, encourage ongoing improvements, and identify any issues or problems early on and work together to resolve them. To ensure that someone is responsible for this, both the agency and provider nominate a relationship manager for each of their outcome agreements. The contract management section also covers what reporting is required and when special inquiry requests may be made, and confirms that statutory audits may be undertaken. In addition to the regular communication described in the previous slide, the provider will provide regular reports to the agency as described in the outcome agreement. If the agency believes that the provider may have breached the term of an outcome agreement, it can ask for information to establish whether there has been a breach, and if there has been, why it happened, or conduct an audit as to whether it was a one-off incident or more systematic failing. This right is described as a special inquiry right. In addition to the special inquiry right, some agencies may be required or permitted by law to audit the services or the provider. The audit right is referred to as a statutory audit right. If an agency is required or permitted by law to audit the provider or the provision of services, and the agency knows the anticipated dates when the statutory audits will be undertaken, it should record those in the outcome agreement. Underpinning the entire contract management approach are the principles of coordination and cooperation, especially where an outcome agreement has multiple agencies and one provider. These principles are embedded in the framework terms and conditions and outline how the parties are expected to work together. The agency will work with the provider and other agencies who are also parties to the same outcome agreement to minimise the amount of reporting the provider has to produce by trying to align and consolidate reporting requirements of the different agencies as much as possible. Give the provider reasonable notice if they want further information in relation to a special inquiry request or undertake a statutory audit of the provider, and limit requests for further information as statutory audits based on managing identified risks. This section is about conditions that may be included in the outcome agreement. When we refer to conditions here, we mean a clause that requires one party to the outcome agreement to do something, generally by a certain date, with a known consequence for not performing it by that date, and addresses something that is not already included in the framework terms and conditions. For example, something that is necessary for a single contract but will not be required for all contracts between government agencies and providers. Some conditions need to be satisfied or performed before the outcome agreement is entered, where others may require ongoing performance throughout the term of the outcome agreement. The framework terms and conditions and outcome agreement specify a range of consequences for not performing any conditions, which include agreeing to a remedy plan to address the non-performance, suspending the services, or taking specific action described in the framework terms and conditions or outcome agreement. Both the provider and the agency can negotiate to include conditions that the other must meet. The guiding principle with requesting the inclusion of conditions is that the condition must be necessary to manage or mitigate a risk identified by either party. The decision support tool, which we discuss later in this webinar, is a useful aid to determining whether any additional conditions should be included in an outcome agreement or the outcome agreement management plan. This section is about information that the provider must give the agency. The provider must tell the agency in writing if it changes its legal structure, or the provider or any of its personnel or contractors are investigated for or have been charged with a criminal offence that could impact on delivering the services. That includes offences that could damage the provider's or the agency's reputation. In both situations, the agency and provider will discuss what an appropriate response should be, since there won't be one right approach that should apply in all circumstances. An agency may offer incentives to the provider in addition to paying for the services. Examples of incentives could be offering a longer contract term in return for good performance, or relaxing or reducing reporting requirements over time. All incentives are at the agency's discretion and are entirely optional, but they are included to encourage agencies to consider whether offering an incentive will improve the relationship with the provider and or the outcomes being achieved by the provider. If the provider or the agency thinks there is a dispute, they must raise it in writing. The first step is for the relationship managers to try and negotiate a solution together. If they can't resolve the dispute within 21 days, then either the agency or provider may refer the dispute to mediation. Both negotiation and mediation should be tried before formal legal proceedings are commenced. Litigation should be a last resort, but the clauses provide flexibility to ensure that neither party is prevented from taking urgent legal action necessary to preserve its respective rights. This section is about how confidentiality will be maintained and how confidential information will be handled. The general rule is that all information relating to or in connection with an outcome agreement is confidential. This is deliberately wide. If either party wants to disclose confidential information, they need the consent of the person who owns or provided the information. Confidential information includes personal information, which is information about an identifiable individual. Personal information is always confidential. If the provider or agency want to disclose someone's personal information, they need that individual's written consent. Sometimes disclosing confidential information is allowed. For example, if the provider or the agency is required by law to disclose it, if the provider or agency has to disclose it to be able to comply with the outcome agreement, if the information is made public and both the provider and agency agree that it no longer needs it to be kept confidential, or both the provider and agency agree that the confidential information may be disclosed to certain third parties, for example an auditor who has first signed a confidentiality agreement. This section is about who owns intellectual property, or IP as it's commonly known, and when the non-owning party may use that IP. Any IP that either party owned before the outcome agreement starts remains theirs. The starting position is that all new IP that the provider develops while they're delivering the services belongs to them, unless the parties agree a different arrangement in the outcome agreement. Both the provider and agency must agree on how any new IP will be used by the party who doesn't own it. That is referred to as a license to use new IP. Irrespective of who owns the new IP, the owner of the new IP grants the other party a limited license to use that new IP for any purpose connected with performing its obligations under the outcome agreement. That means the provider and agency will need to agree when and how that new IP will be used. If they can't agree about this, then the starting position is reversed and the new IP will belong to the agency that paid for its creation, with the provider having a license to use that new IP. The framework terms and conditions covers when and how an outcome agreement may be terminated. Either party can stop participating in or terminate the outcome agreement by giving 90 days written notice. If one of the parties breaches the outcome agreement, they have 14 days to rectify the breach, unless an alternative period is agreed. If they don't, then the outcome agreement can be terminated. If there has been a breach, the parties have the option to put a remedy plan in place. A remedy plan is an action plan which describes the steps that will be taken, including time frame, to put the breach right. Both parties must comply with their respective obligations in any remedy plan. If the breach is not put right in the time frame described in the remedy plan, the outcome agreement may be terminated. So, what happens if the outcome agreement is terminated? The provider must stop delivering the services on the day of the termination. Final payment will be made or refunds discussed if the provider has been paid in advance and not all services have been performed. Both parties will work together to agree a transition plan to transition the services to a new provider, if applicable. If there is more than one agency and one of them wants to stop participating in the agreement but the others want to continue, then they can terminate just their portion of the agreement and the rest of it will carry on without them. If the provider delivers services which are unsatisfactory and they don't meet the targets or satisfy conditions described in the outcome agreement, then the agency may ask the provider to make a repayment if they were paid in advance and not in arrears, reduce the amount they're paid next time, or suspend or delay payment until a remedy plan is agreed and its obligations performed. If the agency does any of these, the amount reduced, withheld, or repaid must be reasonable given the services that have been provided and the circumstances giving rise to the non-performance. Under indemnity, if the provider breaches the agreement, and because of that breach, the agency ends up getting sued by a third party, the provider must meet the full cost of the agency's losses associated with that lawsuit. The exception is if the agency has caused or contributed to those losses by its own negligence, breach of outcome agreement, or willful misconduct. And finally, the General Terms section, which covers a number of important but relatively small areas, like relationship between agencies who are party to the same outcome agreement. That is, an agency can't represent other agencies. Variation process, subcontracting and assigning processes, comply with laws, notices, conflict of interest, and more. To recap, the framework terms and conditions are standard contractual terms that apply to all outcome agreements between agencies and providers. They are incorporated into each outcome agreement by reference. The framework terms and conditions sets out the obligations of the provider and the purchasing agencies for the services being purchased under each outcome agreement. That's the framework terms and conditions and the end of part 2 of this webinar. The last part of the webinar will look at the remainder of the framework, the decision support tool, outcome agreement, and outcome agreement management plan.